Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what I did, but I managed to cut myself off. I don't
You,
think I touched anything on the computer.
no, I think somebody was else was trying to log in with an admin account or something and killed it. That's what it
Okay.
looked like.
Anyway, we're back. But anyway, the Dreyfus trial, before he was sent off to prison, he was formally stripped of all his insignia, all his medals in the courtyard there. And while this was going on, there were mobs marching through the streets of Paris, chanting death to the Jews. And it suddenly struck Herzl, if in France, the most liberal nation in Europe, 100 years after the French Revolution, there was still that much latent anti-Semitism that could be brought to the surface that easily. There was no future for the Jews in Europe. That anti-Semitism would never be eradicated from Europe. The Jews had to get out of there. Some of his early writings, you really get the impression he may be one of these rare people who actually had a premonition of the Holocaust. He was not a religious person. He didn't care about rebuilding the temple or rebuilding Zion or anything like that. He just wanted the Jews out of Europe, essentially. Um, in 1896, he published a pamphlet called the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, where he actually outlined, his plans for what a Jewish state should be like. And again, he didn't really care if it were in Palestine or somewhere else. He didn't really have the religious feeling that most of the other Zionists had. He just wanted a safe place for the Jews outside of Europe. Um, but in 1897, he started the First International Zionist Congress. Zionist organizations were organized in America and all the European countries, and they all met together in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. Um, and this was really the beginning of the state of Israel. This was a practical thing that actually succeeded. Um, they organized agricultural schools in Russia so that the kids going to Israel actually knew what they were doing. They started fundraising organizations in America and in Europe to raise money for immigration and settlement. And this is when Zionism really became serious, once Herzl got it organized. Um, the second Aliyah started in 1904 as a result of his influence. And this second Aliyah is the one that really succeeded. These were the settlements that succeeded. And actually, out of that second Aliyah really came most of the leaders who were later to form the modern state of Israel. Um, the problem is that Jews can't agree on anything, and they couldn't agree on Zionism. They actually broke up into three factions. One was Herzl faction, and he called his kind of Zionism political Zionism. He was convinced that the Jews could never do this by themselves. They really had to have the backing of a major European power. And he really spent the rest of his life going from one country to another, trying to get one of the European powers to back the Zionist enterprise. The other group was called Practical Zionists, and they believe in just creating facts on the ground. Just keep on buying land, keep on setting up settlements, and the future will take care of itself. You'll reach a critical mass of people, and then you can worry about forming a nation. And then there were the cultural Zionists, and these were people who really believed that the whole thing was crazy. They didn't believe that it's possible to form a Jewish nation state in Israel. And even if you could, they didn't believe the Jews should have a nation state. Mainly these were very idealistic people, some of them, and they realized that nation states have to do nasty things, to survive. And they didn't want Jews involved in that. You can see what's going on now. Jews are having to kill Palestinian children in order to survive. They really have no choice. And the cultural Zionists were really idealists who didn't want to get into that. They believed that they could probably set up a cultural center in Palestine if the Ottomans would allow it. And this would be a place where Jewish intellectuals would go, and it would be a cultural center for world Zionism. But they didn't like the whole idea of a nation state. Um, but anyway, Herzl spent the rest of his life, as I said, looking for that support. As a good German, the first thing he did was go to the Kaiser to see if he could get Germany to support it, which actually was not a bad idea because toward the end of the 19th century, the new European nations were stealing all of Africa and Asia they could get. That was a big area of colonialism. And Germany had fallen behind in the race for colonies. The French and the Dutch and the English had really stolen most of Africa and a good bit of Asia. And the Germans had very little. And one thing that interested the Kaiser, maybe the Middle East, was the place for German colonies. One of his big projects was the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, which he was building to connect Germany to the Middle East. He actually gave Herzl an interview and was very favorable toward it. One of the problems was that the Kaiser was not the most mentally stable person in the world, and he promptly forgot about the whole thing. And Herzl was never able to talk to him again, so that failed. His next try was with the Ottoman Sultan. He actually managed to bribe his way to an audience with the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, and he knew that the Ottoman Empire was way over its head in debt. They needed some financial support, and he offered to buy Palestine. He said if the Sultan would sell him Palestine, he could raise enough money from wealthy Jews to do it. And the Sultan actually agreed. But then Herzl was unable to find enough wealthy Jews who were willing to back it. So that fell through. The third place he tried was England, where Arthur Balfour was prime minister at the time. This was around, I think, early, I think 1901 or 1902. And uh, 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 Balfour wouldn't see him. He wasn't interested, but he did get an audience with Joseph Chamberlain, who was the colonial secretary. And as it happened about that time, the British had just stolen a huge chunk of East Africa that was later going to become Kenya and Uganda. And Chamberlain didn't particularly like Jews. He was actually an anti-Semite himself, but he actually thought that it might be a good idea to have some white settlers there. It might make the area easier to govern. So he offered Uganda to Herzl. Uganda could be the Jewish homeland. And Herzl thought it was a great idea. Again, he was not a religious Jew. He didn't really care that much about Jerusalem. He just wanted a place for the Jews to go. And so he brought back the Uganda idea to the next Zionist Congress and was booed off the stage. He really had no idea of how strongly, most of the delegates felt about going back to Israel. So the Uganda thing got dropped, and and he actually never really lived to see the thing come true. He died in 1914. Actually, no, in 1904. So his career really was very short. And the Dreyfus trial was 1894, but he died in 1904. But really, his impact was enormous. It's kind of interesting. Most of his friends that he grew up with, other Viennese Jews and the Western European Jews, thought he was a complete nut. He thought he was crazy. The whole idea, was never going to happen. And they were happy where they were. They were assimilating into Germany and France and England, and they knew that there was anti-Semitism still there. But they believed in progress. As Europe got to be more as, as there was economic progress and more education, anti-Semitism would eventually fade out of European culture. Progress was another big 19th century idea, and it was in the East really that he made his impact. In fact, David Ben-Gurion in his memoirs, he said one of the earliest childhood memories he had in a little Polish village where he grew up. He must have been like 7 or 8 years old. And one morning he noticed there were people running out of their houses into the streets. And he asked his mother what all the excitement about. And she said, there's a famous professor from Vienna, that's come to visit us here. So wherever he went in Russia, there were huge crowds that came out to see him. And he was really the inspiration for the Eastern European Jews who actually did form the modern state of Israel. And if you've ever seen pictures of him, he really looked like he was fit for the part. He was about 6 feet 3 inches high, very tall man. He had this really impressive long black beard, came down almost waist length. He looked like an Old Testament prophet. He always dressed very formally. And basically, if you were to go to central casting and look for somebody, to head the Zionist movement, just on looks alone, you would pick Theodore Herzl. And so even though he died after only 10 years in 1904, he really probably deserves most of the credit, for the modern Zionist movement. Um, but there was a mixed reaction from Jews. Today, we're living the age of AIPAC, and everybody assumes that every Jew is a Zionist. And it's probably true. There are very few Jews, who are not at least passively, behind the Zionist movement. That was not true at all when Herzl first began. For instance, Reform Judaism was dead set against it. They really believed that nationalism was part of the Jewish past. It had no place in the modern world. There were not going to be a Jewish nation again. Our destiny was to be in diaspora and carry, God's message to the nations. That's what we were chosen for. One leader of the Reform movement said, "Cincinnati is my Jerusalem." You know, and they were dead set against it. One of the great Jewish philanthropists of the early 20th century, blocking his name, Jacob Schiff. He was leader of a German Jewish community. He was the managing partner of Kuhn Loeb on Wall Street, probably the wealthiest Jew in America in the early 20th century. And he actually was one of the founding members of Temple Emmanuel, which is one of the flagship institutions of the Reform movement on Fifth Avenue in New York. But he also was one of the biggest contributors to the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement, and sat on its board for years. In addition to which, he actually, at his own expense, built a small Orthodox synagogue of the Lower East Side of New York, just so he could go there twice a year on his parents' yahrzeit. He supported the whole thing all year long, and he gave millions of dollars to other non-Jewish charities. The one thing he refused to give a penny to on principle was the Zionist movement. He was a typical Reform Jew who really believed that Zionism was totally wrong. In fact, the Reform movement really didn't change its official stance on that until 1937. And that's because you had all these refugees from the Nazis being turned away from America and having nowhere to go. And it finally occurred to the Reform movement, it might be a good place for Jews to have somewhere to go. And they finally reversed themselves in 1937. Orthodox Judaism really split on it. There were some Orthodox Jews, and of course, Hirsch Kalisker was one of the impulses behind the first Aliyah. And there are a lot of Orthodox Jews who believe, yeah, this is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And we've been waiting 19 centuries for this. And they were really behind it. But there were other Orthodox Jews, mainly the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi Jews, who were dead set against it. Because after all these centuries, they really bought into the idea that you have to wait till the Messiah comes. When Messiah comes, we'll go back to Israel and the temple will be rebuilt. For anybody to do that before then is blasphemous. Men are not, the Jews are not meant to do that on their own. They have to wait for the Messiah. The other thing which bothered them, which they didn't talk so much about, is as far as they were concerned, the wrong Jews were doing it anyway, because most of the other early pioneers were not religious Jews. And that really bothered a lot of the ultra-Orthodox. And even to this day, there are some of the ultra-Orthodox who don't recognize the state of Israel. The Satmar Hasidim, for instance, who are zealously anti-Zionist, they're actually ultra-Orthodox living in Israel, who don't recognize the state. They cash the welfare checks, but they don't officially recognize the state. And so some of that really is still present. Um, the one branch of Judaism, which actually from the very beginning was 100% behind the Zionist movement, was conservative Judaism. It's one thing American conservative Jews can really be proud of. That they were the only branch of Judaism that wholeheartedly backed Zionism from the very beginning. And then, of course, there were the secular Jews, and many of them really were very enthusiastic Zionists because it gave them a way to identify with Judaism, without getting into the religion. They didn't want to go to synagogue, they were not interested in that, but it gave them something outside the synagogue, they could express their Jewish identity in. So it really was kind of a mixed reaction. Um, Herzl in the end turned out, in a sense, to be right. He finally did get a great power to back the Zionist movement, even though he never lived long enough to see it. And this is only because of World War One. When World War One broke out, the Ottoman Turks made a big mistake and joined what we call the Central Powers. They joined Austria and Germany on their side, which meant that after they were defeated, there was no longer an Ottoman Empire, and Palestine was then open. And the man who was most influential during World War One was Chaim Weizmann. And Chaim Weizmann really was very, very different from Herzl. He was an Eastern European Jew, Polish Jew, who grew up in a religious household. He came from a totally different background, but he also was a chemist. He was a modern Orthodox Jew who believed in secular education. He became a chemist and actually ended up in England teaching chemistry at the University of Manchester. But he also became head of the British Zionist movement and wrote very widely, got the attention of some members of the British government. Um, and actually, in 1906, after the Balfour government was out of office and Labour was temporarily in office, Arthur Balfour actually invited Herzl to lunch one day. And he said, I've always been curious. Back when I was prime minister, you came here, Theodore Herzl came here to England, and we offered him Uganda, and he wouldn't take it. And I've never understood that. I thought you people wanted a place to live, and we offered you Uganda. And of course, Weizmann's famous answer was, if I offered you Paris instead of London, would you take it? And of course, Balfour said, well, that's a silly question. We've always had London. And of course, Weizmann's answer was, we had Jerusalem when London was a swamp. And and so Balfour said, you may get your state someday. And Balfour happened to be in the British War Cabinet, when World War One broke out. Uh, Weizmann also came to the attention of the government because one of the critical war materials in World War One was acetone. It was used in making high explosives for artillery shells and bombs. And there was a method of making it that was very, very long and very expensive. And Weizmann, as a chemist, actually came up with a much more efficient, cost-effective way of manufacturing acetone, which brought him to the attention of the British War Cabinet, and gave him an in. He could actually lobby these people. And of course, the result of all this was the Balfour Declaration, of 1917. It really was not a declaration. Basically, it was a letter that Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild, who's another one of the leaders of the British Zionists. And he said, it's really just one sentence. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of the object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And you notice this was never a law passed by Parliament. This was just a resolution of the War Cabinet, which made it easy for the British to renege on it, years later. And also, if you look at it, it's written in very, very diplomatic language. It was going to be a Jewish homeland, and nobody really knows exactly what a homeland means. Was it going to be a Jewish colony in the British Empire? Was going to be a Jewish nation in the British Commonwealth, like Australia or Canada? Um, it left it wide open for interpretation. And also, he said, nothing shall be done that will prejudice the rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs. So the British already recognized their rights, and it was going to be a matter of balancing the two things. Um, and there's been stacks of books written on the Balfour Declaration, and the real question is, why did the British do it? Great powers don't go around giving away real estate just for sentimental reasons. There had to be some real geopolitical reason why the British War Cabinet would want to give Palestine to the Jews, or at least part of Palestine to the Jews. And there are two theories about it, neither one of which really uh, has proved to be true. One theory was that in 1917, Britain had been at war already for 3 years, and they were totally stalemated. You know, they were stuck in trench warfare all through Belgium and France on the Western Front. They had already suffered horrendous casualties and were not making any progress at all. During 1917 in February, the Tsarist government of Russia was overthrown by the social revolutionaries. And Russia had actually entered the war against Germany. Russia, France, and Britain had a treaty. That if any one of them were attacked by Germany, the others would come to their aid and attack Germany. So when the Kaiser attacked France, uh, the uh, um, the Russian Tsar Nicholas, kept his word and attacked Germany. And so half of the German army was tied up on the Eastern Front. Russia was losing over there. They were taking huge casualties. It was one of the reasons the Tsarist government probably was overthrown. But as long as the Russians stayed in the war, half of the German military was tied up on the Eastern Front and couldn't be used in France against the French and British. And what the British were really afraid of in February of 1917, that the new government was going to make a separate peace with Germany and take Russia out of the war. And they knew that a lot of the social revolutionaries who overthrew the Tsarist government were Jews. Jews were very active in the early communist movement, and they thought maybe this might be a goodwill gesture toward the Jews, to influence Russia, the new Russian government, to stay in the war. That most historians really discount that, though. The kind of Jews who joined the Communist Party and who were active in the Russian Revolution had left Judaism behind a long time before. They were not sympathetic to Judaism in any way, shape, or form. And this probably had nothing to do with the Balfour Declaration. And actually, in October of 1917, the Russian Revolution went into its second phase. Lenin's Bolsheviks took over. And one of the first things they did was make a separate peace with Germany. So that doesn't appear to be the rationale for the Balfour Declaration. Now, the other major war aim, though, that Britain had in 1917 was to get America into the war on their side. And one of Woodrow Wilson's closest advisors was Louis Brandeis, who he was later to put on the Supreme Court. And Louis Brandeis also happened to be the president of the American Zionist Organization. So one theory is this was a gesture toward Brandeis, to get him to influence Woodrow Wilson to get America into the war, which, it's possible, but actually nothing that either Wilson or Brandeis left in their writings or their memoirs mentions that at all. So there really is no proof that really was a factor in the Balfour Declaration. And there are actually some people who believe that actually this may be one of the rare moments in history where a great power did something just to be doing the right thing. That Arthur Balfour really was a very idealistic Christian, and this actually may have been what was really behind it. Actually, the historian Barbara Tuchman has actually written a book about it called Bible and Sword, where she makes a very, very strong case that Arthur Balfour's Christian background was what really influenced him to support the Jewish homeland. We'll never know for sure, but if you want to read Barbara Tuchman's book, it makes a pretty good argument for it. Um, and of course, during the war, the British and French were the ones who got to carve up the Middle East. Fortunately, the Russians had no part in it because the Allies refused to recognize Lenin's new government, and so the Soviet Union was not represented at the Paris peace talks. So that left the French and the British to carve up the Middle East, and they did that with a treaty called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And what worked out was that England would get what was called Transjordan, and would also create a new country called Iraq, which never existed before. It's something the British simply drew some lines on a map and created. And the French would get Syria and Lebanon. Um, who would get Palestine was kind of up in the air because the French claimed it because they were using the old Roman Empire maps of the Middle East. And if you remember, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion failed, Hadrian decided to annex that area, Judea, to Syria, with Syria, Palestina on the Roman maps. And so the French were claiming that Palestine was part of Syria and really was should be run by the French. But the English claimed it, as part of their part of the Middle East. And it was really settled by the fact that the English had an army there at the time and the French didn't. So the French had to back down, and the British ended up getting Palestine. One of the interesting sidelights at the Paris Peace Conference, though, is that England was really deeply in debt at the end of World War One. They needed more loans from America, and so it was very important for Lloyd George, who was the present Prime Minister, to stay on the good side of Woodrow Wilson. And so one of the things that he did was to offer Woodrow Wilson the Palestine Mandate. And you really and Woodrow Wilson agreed. He was always looking for some new place in the world to save. And he thought it would be a great idea to have America take over Palestine, and guide its development. It never worked out. When Woodrow Wilson got home, he couldn't sell the whole thing to Congress. Congress refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty. They refused to join the League of Nations, and the whole thing died. But it's interesting to imagine what might have happened if America had taken the Palestine Mandate, and the growth of the state of Israel had been guided by America from the very beginning. Um, Later on, when the League of Nations was formed after World War One, it gave out the mandates to France and to Britain for the Middle East, and the language of the Balfour Declaration was included in the mandate, so that gave it, formal legal status as far as what the British were doing there. Um, but the way the British divided up the Middle East really is a source of a lot of trouble that's there now. For instance, most historians and politicians agree that Iraq should have never existed. It was made up in the north of Kurds, in the middle of Sunni Muslims, and in the south Shia Muslims, people that want nothing to do with each other. And the Ottoman Turks realized that when it was part of the Ottoman Empire, it was governed as three separate provinces. The British just created a new nation out of nothing, and which has been nothing but trouble since then. Iraq has never been a stable nation because it never should have existed as a nation in the first place. Um, and also the Arabs were really betrayed. One of the promises that Britain made to the Arabs, they were trying to spark an Arab uprising against the Turks during World War One. They sent Colonel Lawrence of Arabia, to negotiate with the Arabs. And if you saw the movie, actually what happened. They promised the Hashemite family in Arabia that there would be an Arab kingdom in the Middle East, after the Turks had been defeated and driven out, and again betrayed them. So you had Arab hostility to the European powers to begin with, and as far as a lot of the Arabs were concerned, the Zionist settlers who were coming in were a bunch of white European colonists that the British were bringing in, and this was just one more example of British colonialism. And so it got off to a bad start, really, from the very beginning, given the way that it was handled. But starting in 1921, there was a third Aliyah. Now that there was, British backing, for a Jewish homeland, then emigration from Europe picked up even further, and the third Aliyah started in the early 1920s. And actually, during the 1920s, a lot of the institutions that really were necessary for the later state were really founded. The Hebrew University in Jerusalem was founded in 1924. The Histadrut, which is that sort of huge mega labor union that really ran Israel, and so really fairly recently in its history, was formed during the 1920s. The kibbutz movement, really took off in the 1920s. Um, and then the kibbutz movement was something really unique that the Zionists created. Many of the early kibbutzim were really experiments in really pure communism. Everyone lived in this sort of huge dormitory or barracks. Everyone had to work, men and women. So childcare was taken care of in a kibbutz nursery. Everybody ate in a common dining hall. After dinner, they might listen to the programs on the kibbutz radio. There was really no private property other than the clothes that you wore. It was really kind of an experiment in pure idealistic communism, and it actually worked. First of all, it was really necessary, given the really hard conditions of life in the early years. Everybody did have to work. There was no room really for private property or for mothers staying home to raise their own children. And so the kibbutz was really a necessity. And most of the leaders of the modern state of Israel really came out of that kibbutz movement in the 1920s. David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, uh, Peretz, Ariel Sharon, almost all the leaders of the early state of Israel really came out of that kibbutz movement. So it really was the incubator. Even though the kibbutz movement in modern Israel, obviously has been modified. If you've ever visited Israel and spent a night on a kibbutz, it's not like summer camp anymore. Some of these are really, fairly luxurious places. They've adopted the modern world. The communist model doesn't really work, in a wealthy industrial state. And so the kibbutzim really sort of modified, the way they live. There is private property now, but they still really were the seedbed that the modern state of Israel really came out of. Um, and the other thing was the cultural renaissance. In a way, everybody was kind of right. Herzl's political Zionism, had its own victory with the Balfour Declaration. That's what Herzl was looking for. But again, the people who came in the early years and built the early settlements, the practical Zionists made their contribution, and even the cultural Zionists. One of the great achievements of the 1920s, or actually even before, were the cultural achievements, the establishment of Hebrew as a modern language, which really nobody could have predicted. It's really, to me, it's what everybody talks about, all the high tech stuff in Israel and all the military victories, which are really impressive. But to me, one of the most impressive things about it is they actually took the ancient language of the Bible and made it the language of a modern industrial state. As far as I know, that's never happened anywhere in history, outside of that. Um, a lot of it was due to the work of one man. He was actually an Eastern European, a Polish yeshiva student named Lazer Perlman. And somehow in the 1890s, he got this crazy idea that it was his destiny to bring back Hebrew as a modern language in Israel. There had been some effort to do that before. Remember when we talked about the 18th century Enlightenment in Germany, people like Moses Mendelssohn really tried hard to get rid of Yiddish. They really believed that modern Jews should not be speaking Yiddish. It was a ghetto jargon. They had to get rid of it. But then the question was, if Jews were not going to speak Yiddish, what unique Jewish language was left? Well, Hebrew. They actually promoted Hebrew. And actually, there were people in Europe who began writing novels in Hebrew, and even in the 19th century. So there was some background for it. But Lazer Perlman moved to Jerusalem in 1903, and he set up this rule in his house: nothing would be spoken except Hebrew. And at that time, their people were speaking literally dozens of languages. The official language was Turkish, while it was still part of the Ottoman Empire. Most of the local people spoke Arabic. The Zionist pioneers that came there spoke whatever language they brought with them, Russian, German, Polish, Yiddish, whatever. And Lazer Perlman determined that nothing but Hebrew would be spoken in his house. He even changed his name. A lot of the pioneers dropped their European names and gave themselves Hebrew names. So he became Eliezer ben Yehuda. That's what he took on it as his name. And actually, he held to it. Nobody was allowed to speak any other language but Hebrew in his house. After about 6 months of this, his wife had a nervous breakdown and left him. But he married one of her sisters and went on. There's several biographies of him. And one of the things that you realize as you read about it, he was probably a lunatic. But then when you think about it, only a lunatic would take on a job like that. There's some things that are so impossible or so improbable, but only a lunatic would do it. And Eliezer Ben Yehuda might very well have been a lunatic, but he got a bunch of like-minded people, and the idea spread. More and more people began speaking Hebrew, and the turning point really came in 1911 when the Technion was dedicated in Haifa. And the Technion is kind of Israel's MIT. It was one of the first major scientific institutions that was set up in Israel. And there was a debate about what the language of instruction should be. And the original idea was it should be German for a couple of reasons. One is wealthy German Jews were among the major contributors to it. And the other was in the late 19th and early 20th century, most of the best scientific work in the world was being done in German. Most of the best scientific publications were being written in German. So German really was the logical language for a scientific institute. And Ben Yehuda actually organized this national movement, to make Hebrew the language. Of course, the objection was, how can you possibly teach chemistry or physics with the vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible? You obviously couldn't. And so Ben Yehuda set to work. He organized a committee, and they literally coined thousands of new words for the modern Hebrew language. And what they really did actually is to go back to the Bible, take biblical roots, and simply rework them to make modern Hebrew words. A good example is the word gadol, which simply means big. It's one of the most basic biblical Hebrew words. In an Israeli laboratory, a microscope is a magdelet, something that makes big. In the ancient temple, a sacrifice was called a karban, from the Hebrew verb karav, to bring near. You were bringing near something when you brought a sacrifice. In an Israeli planetarium now, the telescope is a makrevet, something which brings near. Another basic biblical Hebrew word was gavar, which means really, it sort of means strong, aggressive, militant. When David or Saul would go to battle, they would get their Gibborim, their mighty men around them. And now in an Israeli rock concert, an amplifier is a magber. One that I particularly like, is the story in Genesis when the God wants to create Eve for Adam, and he puts Adam into a very deep sleep. And the word that he uses for that sleep is tardema, which is not the usual Hebrew word for sleep. It only appears a couple of times in the Bible, and it means an unusually deep sleep, not a normal sleep. And so today in an Israeli ICU, the word for coma is tardemet. They're taken from that. And they use this to coin thousands of new Hebrew words. They started a dictionary of the modern Hebrew language. They continued all through the 1920s. And this was really the beginning of Hebrew as a modern language. Ben Yehuda died in the late 1920s, but the work really went on. And there's still what is called Hava'ad Lashon Ivrit, the Academy for the Hebrew Language, which still exists in modern Israel. And they're in charge of making up new Hebrew names, usually for new tech stuff. The real problem they have is now that nobody uses them. There is a word for cell phone, in modern Hebrew, but nobody uses it. In Israel, a cell phone's a cell phone. And it's true in most languages. Everybody uses the English tech terms. But there are Hebrew terms for all of that, even though they're not used very much. So that was really his major contribution. Okay. This would probably be a good place to stop. We can pick up again in the 1920s next week. Anybody have any questions, comments? Okay.
Nope, it was good. Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it.
Well, barring technical problems, we'll pick up here. We'll pick up here again next Tuesday.
Sounds good. See y'all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
see you
Betty.
next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.